Okay, hey folks, Mark Locklear here with a quick screencast on Chapter 14 and object-oriented programming and how to define classes. So I think what we're going to do today is just going to say a few words about objects and creating classes. And I think we're going to code a class up. I've got some code off camera here. I won't be just coding this from memory, but essentially I'm going to code it live on screen so you can see that. So I'm just going to say a few words about classes in general, hit the high points of the chapter, and then we'll go from there with the coding exercise. So I talked about this earlier in the semester. I think when we talked about structs, I talked about this some, but this idea of creating classes and objects is that there are a lot of ways to think about this, and it's sort of high level, but the way I like to think about classes is it's a way for us to model real world objects and behavior, right? So I think I used the example in class of a car. So if we're trying to think about how we want to code in software development, how we want to code a car, a class is a way to do that. So we create a car class, and then a car class has various attributes. So it might have wheels, and it might have a color, and it might have a engine size or the number of engine cylinders. So those are, we think about instance variables or members, I think is the term the book uses for those things. And then a class or a car also does stuff. So it might, for the example of a car, you might add a trip to it because a car can drive you places and take you places, but it might have processes associated with it. A better analogy there might be to think about a student class. We talked about that. So a student would have attributes like name, address, maybe how many years they've been in school, those kinds of things. Processes associated with a student might be registering for a class, withdrawing from a class, applying for graduation, let's say. So all of those things are associated with classes. And so I think the example we're going to use today is we're going to create an animal class. So for starters, I'm going to let me get Xcode going here, and then I'll share my screen. Alrighty. So I'm going to get a new Xcode project going here. So I'm going to do create Xcode project. This is going to be command line tool. And so we'll call this animal app. I'll just put it on my desktop, it's fine. Okay. So when we create a new, yours may look a little different than what you have on your screen based on whether you're using Visual Studio or even if you're using a Mac, it may look slightly different. But generally, you should have some kind of hello world program like this. And anytime I create a new application like this, the first thing I like to do is run it, just make sure it builds and there's no other issues. So this will take a couple seconds the first time. As you can see, I've got hello world here, so I'm good to go there. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is, and most of this I just pulled from the book. I looked at the movie class that was about halfway through. That was on, let's see what page that was on, so we've got it. Yeah, so page 529 is where I pulled most of this from. Listen, I understand that it's difficult to look at those examples. I had to flip back and forth between page 529, which sort of gives you the succinct pieces of code for a class, and then looking at the movie list app, you can sort of see it in the bigger context there with use of the header file and things like that. But we're not going to use a header file or anything here. We're just going to code everything just sort of in line inside our application. I'll probably make some mistakes here, and so I'll pause just to get through those steps. But I mean, it's good for you to see like what live coding looks like, and for you to know it's not perfect. Like me even as a professional programmer, I don't get it right the first time. So sort of working through those issues are always, there's value in seeing that. So I'm going to go ahead and use using namespace standard here, just so we've got access to all of those bits and pieces in C++. So the first thing we're going to do is create a class. We're going to call it animal. And So the next thing we think about, so for this animal class, just take a moment and think about what an animal is and what are some attributes of an animal and what some attributes of an animal might be. So I'm just going to take like 5 or 10 seconds here and just let you think about that. Pause the video if you want, just so you can think about it. Okay. So I am going to, again, I'm just sort of pulling these out of thin air. When I created this app, I just sort of pulled them out of thin air. But the first thing we're going to do before we think about objects, and the book covers this, is this idea of private versus public members. So generally our members, or the variables we create, or these attributes, are going to be private. So that's the way I'm going to build this from the get-go. So I'm going to go ahead and set this section up as private. So when I do private like that, anything that follows it in line, these are going to be private variables. So I'm going to do name and type. Okay. So I'm going to do string name equals, and we'll just set it as with an empty string for starters, and then I'll do string type, and then we'll also set this as an empty variable. So when we think about name and type, correct this spelling. So when we think about name and type, so think about an animal. So if we're talking about a dog, it's going to have a dog. And then when I talk about type, what I'm thinking here is, and I'll go ahead and put a comment here, I'm thinking like, is it a mammal, reptile, insect, you know, etc. So when I think about type, that's what I'm thinking. That's not, and this is, you know, where a comment is helpful here, because again, if I didn't have this comment, type could mean anything for an animal, right? It's kind of ambiguous. So it helps to have a comment there. So these are going to be the two attributes, and we'll maybe add some more later just to experiment with some. And maybe during the assignment, I may ask you to add some too. But so so name and type. So now let's move on to our public members. And now we're going to set up our setters and getters. So the book talks about this. You don't have to have these in place, but sort of it's general, good object-oriented programming style to use getters and setters when you're allowing your applications to access variables. And again, the book sort of goes into detail about that, so let me know if you have questions. But again, this is common. Java uses the same idea, and really all object-oriented programming languages have this concept of getters and setters. They're implemented maybe slightly different, but the getters and setters are what's going to allow you to, the getters are going to allow you to access values that are stored in variables, and then setters are going to allow you to set those variables. So let's create getters and setters for each of these. So I'm going to do void. So I'm going to do set name first. So we're going to have a set name, set type, and then a get name, get type. So I'm going to do set name, and then we have to pass the type of variable that it is that we're going to set that with. So in this case, it's going to be a string. And then for the getters, we start out with the variable type. So in this case, name is going to be a string. So I'm going to do string get name. And then no arguments will be passed there, because then we're just getting the value back. We don't need to pass anything to actually set it. Okay. And now let's do the same thing for, and you know, people do this all kinds of ways. I'm just going to sort of cut and paste here, and instead of set name, I'm going to do set type and get type, because again, type is a string also, so we don't have to worry about those. Now the first thing I'm seeing is this error here. So let me see if I can figure out why I'm getting that. And I think that because after class, maybe I need a semicolon. Yeah, okay, good. So you can't quite see my keyboarding here, but I'm sort of saving generally in Xcode, and I think Visual Studio Code probably too. If you have an error like that, even though you change it, sometimes the ID doesn't always update and show you whether the error still exists. So sometimes you need to save. So I'm going to go ahead and run this now. again, I'm seeing this build succeeded, so that's a good sign. Now, notice I'm still seeing hello world. Nothing's changed here. I've created this class. I've created I've created getters and setters for that class, but notice nothing's changed right down here because I haven't actually done anything yet, right? So at this point, let's create our member functions. So all we've done is sort of set the function definitions here. So let's do that. So inside here, and I'll put a comment here that says member functions. So that sort of sets that up. And we'll create a constructor later. Let's go ahead and also maybe add a comment here that says, let's see, define class. So let's go back down to member functions. And now we're going to actually define our setters and getters. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do set name. Also notice these show up here. So if I sort of use the IDE to my advantage, you know, I can sort of by default choose these things. So in this case, it's going to be string name. And then we need to add opening and close parens. And then I'm going to do this name equals name. Okay, just like that. The book talks about this lots of times. It looks like I got a misspelling here. Lots of times you'll see in programming language, you'll see a this dot name, and yeah, you notice that doesn't work here, but this arrow function does. Different for different programming languages. That dot notation is often what that's called. Java uses that. Most other languages do use that, but notice C++ uses this little arrow notation. Okay. All right. So that's our setter for our name. Let's do our getter. So our getter is going to look like string animal, and then we're going to do get name. And then this one is really straightforward. All we do is do return and then name. Okay. Just like that. Okay. All right, I'm going to pause for a second rather than you watching me code these up, and I'm going to go ahead and code up the same for set or the getters and the setters for type, and then I'll come right back in a snap. All righty, so now I have I've actually defined our getters and setter member functions here. You know, again. Basically, this is just the definitions you're setting up for each of these, and then you're defining them here. So now, what this is going to allow us to do is when we actually go down and start creating animal objects, this is going to allow us to access these methods to be able to set various variable names. So that being said, let's go ahead and do that now. So now, again, notice if I run this and compile this, number one, I'm not seeing any errors anywhere. So like as you're sort of logically working through your code, fix the errors as you get them. What I see students do a lot when they first start is they'll code and they're just sort of plowing through it and they're not stopping to compile code at sort of key points. So it's good as you work through code. You know, the first thing I did was create the instance variables. I dealt with any errors there, went ahead and compiled it, make sure it ran. Next thing I did was create the getters and setters, compiled it, make sure it ran. So it's good as you code to sort of look for errors, deal with any syntax errors or anything you're running into at a given time. And, you know, that way you don't write all this code, spend, you know, many minutes, if not many hours writing code, and then trying to go back and debug it after the fact. It should sort of be this iterative process where you're sort of fixing errors as you go. So the next thing we're going to do is let's create a couple of animal objects. So I'm just going to get rid of this. And like, you know, another good technique too is to sort of create comments as you go. So I'll go ahead and do that now because there's a couple of parts to creating an object and then setting, maybe setting some of the members that are associated with it. So, you know, I'm going to say create animal object. So that's one of the things I'm going to do. Let's see, I'm going to set name. I'm going to set type, and then maybe I can output result. Okay. Often when you're approaching programming, you've got multiple tasks to do, it's nice to go in and, you know, just sort of separate yourself from the coding tasks. Just say, hey, I'm just going to put comments in for, like, logically, these are the different tasks that I need to accomplish. And that sort of helps break out the work that you're doing. So first thing we'll do to create an animal object, the way we do that is we just give it the class name. In this case, it's an animal. And then I'm just going to call this animal 1. We can call this anything we want. We can call this food bar, animal 2, whatever. But this name, again, this first part of the class has to be the actual class name that you've created. In this case, it's going to be animal up top here. But then this animal 1 is really any variable you want to call it. Okay. So we've created an animal object. Let's set the name now. So we call the name by first calling the object name and then calling the associated method that goes along with it. So if I start typing animal, if I start typing animal here, notice animal 1 comes up as an option. That's because I just created that variable or that animal object right above it. So if I choose animal 1, and then notice when I hit the dot, notice the options that it gives me here. So these are the methods or the functions that I created above, the getters and setters that are associated with this animal object. So in this case, I want to set the name first, right? I can't get it before I set it. So I'm going to do set name, and in this case, we'll just call it dog. All right, we're going to create an animal object called dog, and then we're also going to set the type. So I'll pause for a second, maybe if you want to pause it too, and sort of guess ahead maybe and see how you can set it. You can do that. Okay, so to set our type, we'll do that animal 1 again because that's the name of our animal object we just created, and then we're going to use set type, and then it's going to be a mammal. Okay. Again, I'm hitting the save button. You notice as soon as I hit save, notice I got this error, so I can go ahead and fix that right now. And then if we want to output the result, I'm just going to paste this in. So I'll do one of these. All right. So I just hit save again, just sanity check that. So now I'm just going to print out the text animal 1 name is, and then I'm doing this animal 1. Now notice I'm doing get name here. And the get name is going to retrieve the name that I set up here, which is dog. So let's go ahead and run this and see how that looks. And sure enough, we see animal 1 is dog, right? And if I name this, if we called it cat, let's say, and then I reran this, notice it's going to change to cat. So I just really wanted you to see that whatever I'm setting here in the setter, that's what the getter is going to return, okay? And now, by the same token, I'm just going to copy and paste this code in so I can do animal type is, and then instead of get name, we're going to do get type, right? And again, if I come back here and I hit the dot, notice it gives me the option here. I can just choose get type, okay? And then if I save this or build and run that, notice I've got type 1 is cat, or animal 1, name is cat, and then the type is going to be mammal, okay? So now let's talk about this idea of a constructor. The book spends quite a bit of time on that. It talks about constructors and destructors. I'm going to only talk about the constructor. The way I like to describe a constructor is it sets the initial state of an object. So for instance, I've created animal 1 here, and then I called the getters and setters. Let's create another animal, and we're going to call it animal 2. And then if I, let's just modify these such that we'll call the getters for animal 2. Now, think about it for a second and think what, and I haven't actually ran this, so I don't know exactly what it's going to do, but let's pause for a second and think about what you think the output is going to be here. So again, I'm calling a getter on an object that I haven't set a value for yet. So you can pause this and think about it, or maybe even try it if you want, but let's pause and think about that. Okay. I think we're going to get null or nil values here. Actually, I think we're going to get empty strings because we're setting the initial values here. So I'm pretty confident we're going to get empty strings. Let's run that and see what we get. Yep. So we just get empty values there. So by default, every class has a constructor. There's a default constructor, but you can also go in and set explicit values by creating your own constructor. And so that's what we'll do here, just so you can sort of see that. So I can go in and let's see, this is going to be public. Yeah, so let's put it, what we'll do is put it at the top of, and I'm going to put a note here. I'm going to say constructor. So I can call this animal. Open and close curly braces, and then now we can set our name equals, I'm just going to stick anything in here just because we just want to see the results. So name and then type, it's going to equal, say none. Okay. So now if I run this, even though I haven't called getters and setters on animal 2, even though I haven't called getters and setters on animal 2, we should see blah and none here as our name and type. Okay, so yeah, we can see that here. So I just wanted to cover that. The last thing I wanted to talk about is this idea of public versus private. So like notice we can't set these private variables of name and type. So for instance, if I'm typing, should be able to do it right here. If I do animal1.name, notice that that's not a part of what we're trying to do here. Sorry about that. The coronavirus is having us. We're sharing a home with my wife, and she just called down to me. So okay. So here, notice we can't do animal.name. Yeah. Notice. In fact, it's interesting that it does this. Notice you got these little strike mark going through name. So I think that's the ID is letting you know that, hey, name is a valid method or instance variable, I guess, that you can call, but then it's sort of got the strike through it there. But let's do this. If we go up and create a, under public, if we create, let's create a new variable called string. I'm just going to call it my new variable, like that. Now, I think, oh, I got a whole bunch of errors off to the side here. Let's see what it does down here. Okay, so it definitely doesn't like that. Let me see. Oh, yeah. String my new variable equals, and then we need to give it some value. I'm just going to call it my var. See if that cleans things up a bit. Okay, and part of the problem is I don't have anything here. Okay, so so I've got this new public variable that I've created. So now if I'll call animal1.my, so notice my new variable, I can call that here. It's probably not a good spot for it because we're not going to be able to see it. Let's take and move it from there. And let's just put the output down here. Let's do. See if we put it inside this print statement. I'm just going to say my var is. All right, so save that. So I'm getting an unexpected expression here. Yeah, I got a semicolon. You have to be careful about cutting and pasting. So now if we run this, I should see the new variable that I created here. I think, yeah, my var is what I could call it here. So that's the idea of this private versus public. The reason we make variables private is we don't want anyone just accessing them any old way. We want to create the associated getters and setters that are associated with those variables, allow us to control how and who can set those. Now, again, I know that's very contrived in the environment we're in because this is relatively small. We're just working with single classes, but if you're in a real project that has multiple classes, multiple people accessing it, this idea of creating this sort of interface, the getters and setters allow you to create this interface between the programmer and the variables and how they're accessed. Okay. Alrighty, that is all for now. As always, if you have questions, let me know. Try to warm up to this idea of classes as much as you can. We're going to do, we're doing chapter 14 this week. We'll do chapter 15 next week, which is inheritance, which is just sort of a continuation of classes and sort of adds this hierarchical model to that. And we'll probably do another exercise just with a straight up class in chapter 15 too, just to give you some more practice with it. But again, as always, let me know if you have questions, and we'll see you soon.